For 24 years, he wore the white coat. He examined patients. He signed prescriptions. He gave federal agents a clean bill of health. He even screened the people who guard the nation's money. There was just one problem. He had never been to medical school, not for a single day. The real Dr. Gerald Barnes was a surgeon in California who had done everything right, earned the degree, earned the license, earned the name. He had no idea that a stranger had stolen all three and was wearing them like a costume. History remembers the famous frauds, the headlines, the arrests. But underneath every headline there are pages no one wanted you to read. The years a lie was allowed to keep working inside the very institutions that were supposed to catch it. This is buried pages. Tonight, the pharmacist who became a doctor by stealing another man's life, and the patient who walked into his office and never walked back out. Before he was a doctor, Gerald Barnes was a pharmacist in the Chicago area. And by the standards of the job, he was good enough to run his own operation. He understood medicine the way a pharmacist does the names, the doses, the language of the prescription pad. He spent his days behind the counter, close to medicine, surrounded by it, filling the orders that other men in white coats wrote down. What he didn't have was the one thing that separates the person who fills the prescription from the person who writes it. He had never gone to medical school. He had never earned the title of doctor. And by every sign of what came later, he wanted it badly. There is a particular kind of resentment that can grow in a person who lives at the edge of something they want, close enough to touch it, never allowed to hold it. A pharmacist knows the drugs as well as anyone. He can spot a bad prescription. He understands the body's chemistry. And every single day, he watches someone with 2 more letters after their name make the decisions, take the title, command the respect. We can't know exactly what Barnes felt, but we can read it backwards from what he did next. In the early 1970s, that career came apart. Barnes was caught up in a Medicaid fraud case, and the fallout cost him his pharmacy license. For most people, that is a closed door. A profession ended. You start over in something else, somewhere else. You absorb the loss and you rebuild a smaller life. Barnes did start over, but not in something else. He looked at the door that had just been slammed in his face, the door marked pharmacist, and instead of walking away, he decided to walk through a bigger one right next to it. If the system wouldn't let him be a pharmacist anymore, he would simply skip ahead over the years of training, over the exams, over the entire idea of earning it, and become a doctor instead. Not by going back to school. By taking the credentials from someone who already had them. In 1976, Barnes moved to California and he went looking for a name. He found one that was almost his own. There was a real, licensed orthopedic surgeon practicing in Stockton, California, named Gerald Barnes. Same first name. A surname 1 letter away from his own. To a man planning to disappear into someone else's identity, that resemblance wasn't a coincidence he stumbled on. It was the seam he had been hunting for. A life that was already shaped, almost exactly like the one he wanted to steal. So Gerald Barnes legally changed his last name to Barnes. Think about the cold patience in that move alone. He didn't fake the name on a form. He went to a court and made it real on paper by law. Now the lie had a foundation no clerk could easily knock over. On the most basic document of all, he truly was Gerald Barnes. And then he did the part that should have been impossible. He needed the real Dr. Barnes' professional documents, the medical license, the proof of the degree. So he picked up the phone, called the state medical board, and told them a simple human story. His paperwork had been destroyed and he needed copies. He gave them the real doctor's information, and the board mailed the copies out. Stop and sit with how small that moment is. There was no forged hologram, no hacked database, no break-in at midnight. A man called a government office, claimed to be someone he wasn't, and asked for that person's medical license in the mail. And it came. That phone call is the whole engine of this story. Everything that follows, the patients, the prescriptions, the dead young man, the federal agents, all of it grows out of one request that nobody on the other end of the line bothered to verify. Because here is the uncomfortable truth underneath this case. Most of our institutions don't actually check whether you are who you say you are. They check whether your paperwork is in order. And paperwork, it turns out, is a costume. Anyone patient enough and shameless enough can put it on. We like to imagine there's a wall around the things that matter: medicine, law, money, guarded by people whose whole job is to keep imposters out. But often there is no wall. There is a form. and a form will believe whatever you write on it. With the real Dr. Barnes' credentials in hand, Gerald Barnbaum became Dr. Gerald Barnes. He opened a practice. He saw patients. He wore the coat, and the strange thing is, by most accounts, he looked the part completely. He had the vocabulary. He had the confidence. He had spent years as a pharmacist, soaked in the language of medicine. To a patient sitting on the table, a calm man in a white coat who uses the right words in the right order is a doctor. We don't ask for the diploma on the wall. We don't call the medical board to confirm him. We trust the room. We trust the coat. We trust the quiet authority in the voice. And that trust, the most ordinary, reasonable trust in the world, was the exact thing he had learned to counterfeit. And for a while, the costume held. Until December of 1979. A 29-year-old man named John McKenzie came in, not feeling well. 29. The age when you still assume your body is on your side. He had the kind of symptoms that are easy to brush aside one at a time, but dangerous together. He was desperately thirsty, the kind of thirst no glass of water touches. He was dizzy. He had been losing weight without trying. To anyone trained to see it, that combination points in one direction, toward the body running out of control, toward diabetes that has gone undiagnosed and started to turn dangerous. A first-year medical student is taught that pattern. It is one of the classic presentations in all of medicine. Excessive thirst, dizziness, unexplained weight loss. The body, starved of the one thing it needs to use its own fuel, beginning to consume itself. The response is not exotic. You check the blood sugar. It is a simple, fast, cheap test. And it is the obvious next step that the situation is practically begging for. The man wearing Dr. Barnes' name did not take it. According to the case, McKenzie was treated as though his problem was something minor, something like vertigo, and sent home. He was a young man who had done the responsible thing. He felt wrong. He went to a doctor. He described his symptoms. He trusted the answer he was given. And the answer he was given was the wrong one, delivered with all the confidence of the coat. He walked back out the door carrying a diagnosis that had nothing to do with what was killing him. John McKenzie died. When his blood sugar was finally measured, it was catastrophically high, the kind of number that tells you the body had been screaming for help for a long time that never came. He was a healthy young man at the start of his life, and a routine medical emergency took him because the person he trusted to recognize it could not. And in one final, grotesque detail, the office still billed him for the visit. The last paperwork generated by Dr. Gerald Barnes in the case of John McKenzie was an invoice. Let's be careful and precise here because precision is the whole point. A real doctor can miss a diagnosis. Medicine is genuinely hard, and even the well-trained make mistakes and people die from them. That by itself is a tragedy, not a crime. But this was not a trained doctor who slipped on a hard case. This was a man with no medical training at all, standing in for one of the most recognizable emergencies there is, and getting it fatally wrong because he had never been taught to get it right. He was later charged, and in 1981 he pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter. The law's finding was measured, and we should be too. His failure to recognize what was happening contributed to the death of an otherwise healthy young man. You would think that would be the end of it. A man practicing medicine without a license, a dead patient, a manslaughter plea. Surely after that the name Gerald Barnes is finished forever. Surely the door finally closes. It didn't, and the reason why is the most disturbing part of this whole story. Because the failure here was never really about one uniquely clever man. A clever fraud you can almost understand. A genius slips through once and we tell ourselves it was a fluke. But this wasn't that. This was a man who got caught and kept being allowed to continue. The failure was about how many separate systems looked directly at him and waved him through. The medical board that mailed out the license. The patients who trusted the coat. The institutions that again and again checked his paperwork instead of checking him. He didn't tunnel under a wall. He walked through a long hallway of open doors, and every time one of them should have swung shut behind him, somehow it stayed open. That should frighten us more than any criminal mastermind ever could, because a mastermind is rare. An unlocked door is everywhere. The real exposure should have come in 1984. That year, the impostor applied for hospital privileges under the name Gerald Barnes. And the paperwork landed somewhere it had never landed before, in front of the real Dr. Gerald Barnes, the actual surgeon. The man whose entire identity had been quietly hollowed out and worn. Imagine being that man for a moment. You spent years of your one life earning a medical degree and a license. You sat the exams. You did the training. You built a career, a reputation, a name you could be proud of. And one day you learn that somewhere out there, another man has been wearing your name like a uniform, seeing patients you never saw, signing off on the health of strangers, making decisions in your name. And now a patient connected to your name is dead, and a manslaughter case is attached to it. The real Dr. Barnes blew the whistle. He was the wronged party in all of this, the genuine victim of the theft, and he did exactly what any of us would pray we'd have the standing to do. He said, "That is not me." And here is where this case stops being a story about a clever fraud and becomes something stranger and harder to explain. Because being exposed did not stop Gerald Barnes. He was caught. He went to prison. And then in time he was released. And when he got out, he did the same thing again. He went back to being Dr. Barnes. Caught, released, back to the white coat. Again and again. Across the years, the pattern simply repeated itself, as if the title were something he physically could not stop reaching for, no matter what it had already cost him and cost others. Each time the law pulled the costume off him, he served his time, he waited, and then he put it back on. Most criminals are chasing money or escape. Barnes, by the end, seemed to be chasing the identity itself. The coat, the title, the moment a frightened patient calls you doctor, and means it. And the most astonishing chapter came in the 1990s, after he had already been caught, already been imprisoned, already been publicly unmasked as a fraud. By the middle of that decade, the fake Dr. Barnes was not hiding in some back alley clinic on the edge of town. He had a respectable practice doing executive physical exams, the thorough, premium checkups that companies pay for to keep their important people healthy. Between 1991 and 1995, that work reportedly brought in more than $400,000. And his clients were not anonymous walk-ins who'd never know the difference. By 1995, the man with no medical training was a staff physician at a firm called Executive Health Group. And through that firm, he was examining agents of the FBI. He was screening officials of the Federal Reserve. Let that sit for a second, because it is almost too perfect to be true. The people whose entire profession is investigating fraud, and the people charged with safeguarding the nation's money, were stripping down to their undershirts and having their health certified by a Chicago pharmacist who had stolen his medical license over the telephone 2 decades earlier. When you say it plainly, it sounds impossible, and that impossibility was his armor. The disguise worked best in exactly the places that should have been hardest to fool, because those places trusted the system. And the system had already failed at the very first step. Nobody screening a polished corporate doctor for the FBI expected to find, underneath the coat, a twice-convicted pharmacist who had legally renamed himself after his victim. The lie was protected by how outrageous it was. It was too big to suspect, but a fraud that runs that long across that many years accumulates a trail it cannot shake. There were the prior convictions. There was a real Dr. Barnes who had already raised the alarm once. There was a paper history, the manslaughter plea, the impersonation, the repeated arrests, all of it attached to a name the man simply would not stop using. He had built his entire life out of documents, and documents in the end are loyal to the truth, not to the person holding them. The same records that let him become Dr. Barnes were the records that finally pinned him to who he had always been. By the year 2000, after roughly 24 years of stepping in and out of a dead man's profession, Gerald Barnes' run as Dr. Barnes came to an end for good. He was prosecuted again. By then, the record described him as a 4-time impostor and sent to prison, where at last the costume stayed off. It is worth being clear about that span of 24 years, because it's easy to misread. It was not 24 uninterrupted years of quietly practicing undetected. It was a span broken up by arrests, by convictions, by prison terms, in which he kept returning to the same lie every single time he was free to. And honestly, that is more unsettling than if he had never been caught at all. Because the version where a genius fools everyone forever is at least a story about a wall being beaten. This is the other version. He was caught. The system worked over and over. And over and over, once it was done with him, it let him walk straight back to the white coat. It's tempting to look at a case like this and marvel at the con man, to make him the genius at the center of the story, the criminal so brilliant he fooled the FBI, but the buried pages here don't really tell the story of a brilliant deceiver. They tell the story of how easy it was. A phone call to a medical board, a name one letter away from his own, a white coat, and the right words said in the right order. That is nearly all it took to stand in front of frightened patients and federal agents, and a 29-year-old man dying of something a first-year student would have caught. John McKenzie should have walked back out of that office with a glucose test and a diagnosis that fit. The real Dr. Gerald Barnes should never have had to spend a day defending a name he earned honestly. And somewhere in the gap between those two men, the patient who trusted the coat and the doctor whose identity was stolen, a disgraced pharmacist found out a quiet, frightening thing about the world. That most of the time, no one is really checking. We trust the costume. We trust the form. We trust the calm voice that says the right words. That's the page most people skip, not the cleverness of the lie, but how many times the truth was sitting right there, in the records, in the warnings, in a dead man's chart, and was simply waved through by someone who only looked at the paperwork. And it's exactly the kind of page we'll keep digging up here on Buried Pages. If this story held you, stay with us, because the next one is already waiting to be uncovered.